Last year, I visited the pottery making village of Mata Ortiz in Chihuahua, Mexico, and I learned a lot from them, including their method for processing clay. Now, as I've said in previous videos, I prefer the dry method of processing clay, which works really good for small batches of relatively pure clay. But right now I'm up against a clay that seems to require a lot more purification than my usual, and so this seems like a good time to try implementing that method of processing clay that I learned in Mata Ortiz last year. So come with me, I'll show you how they process clay in Mata Ortiz, and then I'll show you how you can use the same method at home to process wild clay into usable material. And now, through the magic of video, let's travel back to last year in the sleepy Mexican village of Mata Ortiz, Chihuahua. In this village, a lot of very talented potters make a lot of beautiful pottery every day. And I was able to go there and study how they made their pottery over the course of about a week last January. And I talked to a number of potters about the way they collect and process their wild clay. So after they've gone out and collected their clay out in the country, they put it in water and let it soak for a period of time. Let that clay slake down. They mix it up real good. That gets those clay particles suspended in the water. And then the clay is scooped out of the first bucket and poured through a very fine screen into the second bucket. In most cases, this screen is made out of cloth. The potter demonstrating here is Sabino Villalba, and he's using what looks like an old shirt. This should screen out almost everything that's not very, very small in particle size. So the second bucket, the bucket he's pouring into, this is pretty much pure clay at this point. This second demonstration is by the husband and wife team, Miguel and Adelene. And you can see that their process is pretty much the same as Sabino's. First they put the clay in a bin, they cover it with water, they allow it to slake down, they mix it up really good, and then they scoop it out and they pour it through a strainer. In this case, the strainer they're using is a little more open than the shirt that Sabino was using. But the effect is essentially the same. They're left with a container full of purified clay. Then the clay is allowed to set. As it sets in that second bucket, it settles.
I see what that
The clay settles to the bottom and clear water forms on top. The potter then siphons the clear water off the top of the bucket, leaving thick, pure clay at the bottom of the bucket. Once the potter has purified the clay in this way, the job now is to remove the excess water so that it's a usable consistency for making pottery. So this purified condensed clay mixture that's in the second bucket is now put into a third container, this drying bin. These drying bins are merely wooden boxes that are lined on the bottom with bricks to help absorb that moisture that's coming out of the clay. Before the clay is put into this bin, a sheet lines the inside. That kind of helps keep the clay together, keeps it from running through the cracks and whatnot of the box. And then also when you're done, you can pick up that sheet and move the clay. Once the clay has sat in these drying bins for a period of time, probably days or maybe even weeks, depending on the weather and the relative humidity, once it's firmed up a little bit, that clay is moved indoors, where the clay is wrapped up and set on the floor and allowed to dry further. This keeps it from drying too much so that you have, crusty edges that are too hard to work. And once the clay reaches just the right consistency, it'll be ready for use. As you can see, they have a number of blocks of this clay sitting on their floor, ready to be used. So I went to the hardware store and I picked up this lumber and a bag of plaster of Paris, and I'm going to build one of those big clay drying bins like I saw used in Mexico. But first, I want to go get that clay soaking so that it's all ready to pour through the screen when I have this done. And then I'll come back here and I'll build that clay drying bin. Okay, so this is the clay I'm hoping to process. This is that clay I called Upper Cottonwood Gray. I collected this on my big clay expedition back in September. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it up right over here and down in the doobly-doo, so you can check that out if you want. And this has already been wet and then re-dried. So when I dug it out of the ground, it was in these really solid chunks that had been compressed down in the earth for millions of years. And so when they're like that, sometimes it's really hard to slake it down. It just resists breaking down into smaller pieces. And so it's good to get it wet, soak it, and then let it sit out and dry. And then when you soak it the second time, it's going to break down even further. And so this was a lot more solid chunks, as you can see in the video where I'm digging it, than it is now, because it has already gone through that soaking and drying process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in this bucket, and then I'm going to soak it. I'm going to let it sit with water in it for a day or two while I build that drying bin. By the time I'm done, it should be relatively soaked up, and then I'm going to use my drill to mix it up real good and pour it through a screen like we saw them doing in Mexico. The problem with this clay, as you can see as I'm digging it here, is that it's full of non-clay material. So in this cross section, you can see these little bits of yellow. In some places around this area, this yellow is yellow clay. But it turns out this yellow material is not actually clay at all, but some sort of sandstone, shale. I'm not sure how to classify it. But at any rate, it's not clay, it's grit. And so if I just throw this all in my corn grinder and grind it up, it comes out very, very gritty. So what I want to do is I want to take this and pass it through a screen, remove all the junk quickly and efficiently. That way I'm separating it out and I have just the pure clay. Now I know in Mexico they were using these big 50-gallon barrels, but I don't need anywhere near that amount of clay. So I'm using 2 5-gallon buckets. Hopefully this will be a more manageable amount of clay for me. If I mixed up a 50-gallon drum, I think they'd last me for years potentially. Because despite what some of you may think, I'm not making that much pottery. I spend as much or more time making social media posts and videos than I do actually making pottery. If you're a regular viewer to my channel, you've probably noticed that I don't take sponsorships. I have never once made a sponsored video. And the reason is, I want to make content that is relevant to the subject. So it doesn't make sense if I'm making a video about pottery or clay that I suddenly start talking to you about Squarespace or Better Health. It would make more sense if I had a sponsor that was somehow related to clay or pottery making, but there aren't many of those. And that's why I sponsor my own videos. So I'm going to take a few minutes here today to talk to you about these online masterclasses that I offer on my website. These are video-based online classes that cover one of these subjects comprehensively. There's 4 classes. The one most relevant to this video is the one about wild clay 101, which covers the subject of how to find wild clay, what to look for, how to test it, how to process it, everything you need to know to get started using wild clay. But I also have Coil Pottery 101, which I just completely reworked this year. That's a great comprehensive class about coil pottery building. I also have Outdoor Pottery Firing 101 and one about natural paint slips and pigments. So these are great classes if you want to get started in primitive pottery. And the cost is really affordable. They're $35 a class. You know, I can't take my wife out to McDonald's these days without spending $35. And so really affordable for a comprehensive course of this type. Or you can get all 4 of these classes together, which is a comprehensive course in primitive pottery, for $105. Again, super affordable. So I just wanted to take a minute to make you aware of these classes. Now, if you're interested in learning more about, or you're interested in signing up for these classes, I will put a link to my website where you can do that down in the doobly-doo, which is the description box under the video. Now, back to the content. There you go. You know, it's not perfect. I'm not much of a woodworker, but it's functional and I think it's sturdy enough to hold quite a bit of clay. Now that I've got the box formed, I want to pour that plaster of Paris in the bottom. So if we look at those Mata Ortiz boxes, they had a layer of bricks in the bottom, but those weren't ordinary bricks. Those weren't the kinds of bricks we could buy at Home Depot or Lowe's. Those were what we call in America fired adobe or burned adobe. So those are actually like earthenware bricks. So they're much more porous than your standard Home Depot brick, which is fired much harder and is not nearly as absorptive. So those bricks absorb moisture out of the clay. And I thought about it, and it's hard to find fired adobes in this country. Those that they sell here in Tucson are big. They're like, you know, 8 by 12 and like 4 inches thick. They're big. The ones they were using were much smaller. So maybe I could search around and find some or drive down to Nogales and get some. But what I thought was a faster, easier method for anybody in America would be to pour plaster of Paris in the bottom. Like an inch or 2 of plaster of Paris will absorb a lot of moisture out of that clay and make this work more efficiently. Okay, I had some of these masks left over from COVID. Figured I'd use them. You do not want to breathe this stuff in. I don't know a lot about plaster of Paris. Everything I learned from Tony Soros' video. So I will link that up down in the doobly-doo, one of his videos about plaster of Paris. You can go there, learn a little more about mixing up plaster of Paris. But I want to mix this up and use it pretty fast because it's going to start setting. So I'm going to mix it and I'm going to pour it in there. I'm trying to get it done before it starts getting cold because it's January, the sun's gone down. I'd like to be able to have this all set up by tomorrow. Not enough, not nearly enough, but it's a start. I guess I'll put another coat on this tomorrow. I'm gonna get the rest of this washed up ASAP because I've got it everywhere and it's gonna start firming up quick. All right, this has set up overnight. I can tell with the tape measure how much depth I got on it, which is close to 2 inches in some places, but in other places it's around an inch or less. I was hoping to get at least 3 or more inches of plaster Paris in here, so I have quite a bit of plaster to absorb moisture out of the clay. So that was 4 scoops of plaster. So I think I'm gonna go more this time. So let's try 6 scoops of plaster and we'll see how much depth we get on it then. Whew, getting a backache. I think it's thickening up. I think I need to pour it before it starts getting too thick. Oh, yep. Won't even pour now. Like I said, it thickens up quickly. Well, that was messy. I definitely had way more than I could handle. It almost set up before I got it all in there. In fact, there's a few crusty bits in here that were just falling out of the bucket and were too firm to kind of attach to the rest. So 6 scoops is definitely too much. I think if I did this again, definitely stay with 4 scoops of plaster Paris. Those were big scoops. You know, there's a limit to what you can process and get poured before it starts setting up, and 6 was right at that or just over that limit. I've got a little bit of plaster Paris left in the bag, but it's not enough to mess with. It would not make much of a layer on here. Now, the layer that I have on here, because it was setting up as I put it in, is fairly coarse. You know, it's not really smooth and beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and let this set up and dry for a day or so until I use it. And in the meantime, I'm going to start processing that clay. That clay has sat for 24 hours or so now. It should be pretty well slaked. I'm going to get in there with my drill. I'm going to mix it up really good. And then we're going to start pouring it through a screen. Now, I thought about building a little wooden screen, such as you saw the potters in Mata Ortiz using. But I've got some really good screens already. They came with a gold panning kit, and I think those are going to work really good. I'll put some links down in the doobly-doo to where you can buy some of these yourself on like Amazon or something if you're interested. But hey, you know, using the same basic techniques I used to build this drawing frame, you could go ahead and make yourself a little screen. Now I'm going to screen it through paint strainer bags because that's really similar or maybe the same as the screen I saw Adelene and Miguel using down in Mexico. Some of those potters were using cloth. So keep in mind, if you want it finer, you certainly could use a piece of cloth to make sure you strain it even finer yet. There's still a lot of clay in here. If you reach your hand out in the bucket and feel it, a lot of it hasn't fully slaked down. A lot of it just kind of like soft lumps. And of course, some of it is that non-clay material, that grit. So I'm just gonna fill these buckets up again and let this slake for a while longer, and then we'll go through the same process again. Meanwhile, over here, this bucket is full of clay water. But if I let it sit for an hour or two, that clay will settle in here. I'll have clear water on the top I can pour off. That'll give me room to add more into it. I can always use another bucket if I need to as well. Okay, so it's like 4:45. This has been sitting here for 2 hours, maybe, hour and a half, and it's settled maybe an inch. So obviously I need to let this set longer before I can pour off clear water. I mean, I can pour off a little water, but it needs to settle a lot more. So I'm gonna wait. We'll come back in the morning and see how this is done, see if we can pour off a significant amount of water and put more in it. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to get another bucket involved. But we'll just wait till morning at this point. Okay, it's the next day. This has sat overnight and it's settled quite a bit. So as you can see, there's about 5 or 6 inches of clear water on the top. So I'm gonna pour that off. What's on the bottom is rather dense clay, hopefully dense enough that it will stay inside of, say, a sheet if I pour it into that drying bin. But I'm not ready to do that yet because these buckets still have a lot of clay in them. So I'm gonna keep trying to get the clay out of these buckets and pouring it in here. And I'm going to use another bucket because obviously I don't have as much capacity here as I had yesterday. And then maybe, hopefully tomorrow, I'll be ready to pour this into my drying bin, which has had plenty of time at this point to cure and kind of set up, dry out. So should be working at top efficiency when I'm ready to do it. Oh goodness, how'd that happen? Ah, what a waste. You gotta be careful that you don't overfill it. The trouble with that screen on here was I couldn't see how full it was, and I actually overfilled it, which isn't terrible, but you know, the clay that's fallen on the sidewalk here is actually wasted. Okay, it's the next day, and as you can see, the clay has settled really good overnight. I have a good 6 or 8 inches of clear water on top of the clay, so I'm gonna pour that off. Yesterday I said I'm gonna continue to get clay out of that material, and I can, there's still clay in there, but I also need to move forward with getting this video produced. So I'm not gonna go ahead and keep processing, although I could. What I'm gonna try to do today is get this clay consolidated into a thick mass that I can pour into that drying bin and kind of move forward with the process. There is still clay in the bucket, and I'll get at least 1 or 2 more pours out of that, I think, before I throw the rest out. Okay, let's talk briefly about temper because it didn't even cross my mind this morning, and it should have. All wild clay needs temper. Temper is non-plastic material that's added to the clay body. This lessens the amount of shrinkage, reduces the chance of drying cracks, and protects against thermal shock. It's critical that this non-plastic material, what you might think of as an impurity in the clay, be added to the clay. Pure clay will just crack and break in the firing. Pure clay is of no value. So all clay, all wild clay that is processed, gets temper added to it. It can come in all sorts of forms. It can be sand, it can be grog, that is ground up ceramic material. It can be crushed rock, it can be diatomaceous earth, it can be a lot of things. In Mata Ortiz, when I was there, I asked a number of people about temper, about adding additional materials to their clay. And all of the potters that showed me their process all told me there was nothing else added to the clay. Diego Valles, one of the potters there, told me that he theorizes that there may be volcanic ash naturally in the clays there, and that's what's providing that temper. And it's possible. They're screening it through cloth, remember. You would think that cloth would filter out those volcanic ash particles. They must be incredibly small if that's the case. Whatever it is, everybody else I know in the entire Southwest, well, aside from Hopi clay is known to contain volcanic ash. Aside from the Hopi, everybody else adds temper, and a lot of Hopi potters add a little extra temper as well. So almost everybody else I know of uses some sort of temper in their clay. And that is the reason why I have shied away from wet processing in the past. Because when you wet process clay, you go through this process, maybe not with this bin like this, but in some way you have to, once you've got it wet, you have to remove the water from that clay, and then you have to add the temper and you have to knead it through, and that's a lot of work. Kneading all that temper, wedging it through the clay. And so I tend to think dry processing is easier because I can add it dry and just kind of mix it around in there real easily. Now with this, I could have added it to the bucket, and the last time I did a wet processing clay video, a lot of people left comments and said, why don't you add the temper when it's in the bucket, when it's liquid, then you can mix it up. My thought has always been those larger particles of temper, they're heavier and they will settle to the bottom of the bucket, and you'll still need to knead it to kind of mix it through. So what do you think? could I add temper to the drying bin? Could I just throw the temper material right on top of it here and get some rough idea of the volume? You know, just guessing what maybe 20% of this clay would be. Now remember, this clay is full of water. As it dries, it's going to shrink. It's going to become less volume. So I'm going to have to judge what 20% of what it's going to be when it's not so wet too. So there's a lot of kind of guesswork and eyeballing here. So I think I'm going to try pouring some temper directly in the drying bin at this point, maybe even stirring it around a little bit. So this is some volcanic ash that my friend Jim brought me from, Oklahoma, Arkansas. I haven't even opened it yet. I've had it for months and I haven't had any opportunity to really get into it. So we will see what this looks like. Hopefully it doesn't need grinding. Some of this volcanic ash isn't always powder when it comes out of the ground. Oh, it's got leaves in it. That's not good. Hopefully there's just a couple. Yeah, some of this is pretty hard. This is going to have to be pulverized and screened really well before I can use it. So I will get on that this morning and then see if I can add it to this later on. But I can't throw it in like this or it could just stay in lumps. That would not be good to have in your clay. Okay? Okay, the clay's been in here for a half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. As you can see, it's gone down about 1/4 inch already, and that's just water leaving it. As you can see, the water is running out the bottom of the container. In the meantime, I have been sifting and processing some of this volcanic ash. So I have quite a bit of it here that's been sifted and is fine powdered. I'm ready to add it. The real question is, you know, how much to add. The problem would be if I added too much temper, it's harder to add more pure clay in. So I'm going to err on the side of not enough, and I'm going to just try to add it in here. And like I said, hopefully this dry volcanic ash will also absorb some of the moisture that's in the clay. And get ready to get dirty. Oh, I hope that stuff doesn't cake up. I see it kind of wanting to do that on the top. You don't want, you know, a little caked up chunk of it in your clay. You want it to be all smooth. Look at it, it's like floating like a raft. Weird. I wanted to show you, I just finished pouring the last of the clay out of that bucket. And you can see here in the bottom, there is some clay left. You know, those little gray nuggets are actually clay that never really slaked down right. But there's a lot of gravel and other junk here. So this is all just going to get thrown away. I suppose if I was really desperate, I could kind of try to milk more clay out of it. But I'm at the point of diminishing returns. A little warning, if you decide to process clay this way, be aware of the wind. So I folded the sheet the way I did so that I could cover it in case of wind. But we had several really beautiful, kind of warm, sunny days, no wind, no bad weather, and so I just left it open because, of course, it dries faster if it's exposed to the air. And I got a little complacent about that good weather. And I woke up this morning and I noticed the wind was blowing. And I ran out here and there was already leaves and other junk in my clay. So if you're going to do this, be aware of the weather, keep an eye on it, or if you're not going to keep an eye on it, don't have time for that, and just keep it covered up. That way you don't have to worry about stuff blowing in your clay. You don't want leaves and sticks and things in there. I imagine in the summer you might collect bugs as well. Of course, this is January, so I'm not having that problem. Now this is 5 days after I poured it into the bin, and as you can see, it's drying up nicely, starting to crack in places as that clay kind of contracts, and that's what it should do. It's firm now, it's not liquid anymore. So I think this is the time, although I'm not positive what the indication is to the Mata Ortiz potter when they move it from outdoors to indoors. But I feel like this is a good time to move it now that it's not liquid anymore and let it dry more slowly under cover. Because like I said, I've had this experience before. The way I wet process clay is I pour it into a pillowcase and then I leave it set outside. And what happens is the edges of the pillowcase, the corners and such, will dry up a lot faster than the inside. And you end up with these crusty bits that are unusable and have to be re-slaked and reprocessed. I think moving it inside allows it to dry a lot more slowly and have a completely usable lump of clay when you're done. Okay, so you've probably noticed that this way of processing clay takes a lot longer than dry processing. When I dry process clay, I usually have a block ready to start making pottery after a day, maybe 2. Whereas with this, I've been at this a week, and this clay will probably sit on my studio floor for another week before it's ready to start kneading and putting in bags. So a lot longer process, but a good process, especially if you're processing a large volume of clay, which is why it works great for those potters in Mata Ortiz who make a lot of pots. Now I'm anticipating you have a couple of questions. One, how does that dry processing work? Well, I made a video about that. I'll link that up right over here. 2, what else did you learn when you were down in Mexico with those potters in Mata Ortiz? I made a video about that, and I'll link that up right here. So go check those out, learn more. Thanks for watching today. I'll catch you next time.
Y el barro lo echamos ahí, todo el barro aquí, con el trapo ese lo ponemos y ahí.